Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dentalpreneur podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Costas. What is up, my friends? I hope you're doing great out there in podcast land. We have a very, very interesting guest today. In fact, just in the pre-chat, he was dazzling me with some very cool statistics, and I want to dig deeper into some of the things that we started to speak about. Today, I want to welcome to the podcast Chip Fichtner. Chip is the co-founder of Large Practice Sales, which completed over $600 million of practice transitions in 2022 with 31 IDSOs for clients in 29 states. He has built, bought, and sold multiple companies, both public and private, in a variety of industries for over 40 years now. He has been featured in numerous media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, CNBC. His tolerant wife of 32 years allows him to live on airplanes visiting clients every single week. Welcome to the podcast, Chip. How you doing today?
Doing great, Doctor. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm glad we caught you because you are a very, very busy man. And congratulations on a stellar year in 2022. Sounds like you and your team were very, very busy.
That we were.
Yes. Excellent. Excellent. So I would love to start off by getting your opinion on the state of, the practice transition market right now as we speak. It is a very interesting time to mark this moment in time. Interest rates are raising significantly in comparison to last year. I would love to hear what you're seeing as a result of those interest rate changes in your profession and in your business.
It's interesting in that, first of all, we don't really call what we do the transition business. Transitions really imply that it's an exit strategy for a doctor nearing the end of his career. Okay. So really what we specialize in is partnerships for doctors with what we call invisible dental support organizations. And they're called invisible dental support organizations because they do not rebrand the practices that they invest in. And they always invest in practices where the doctor remains as an owner and continues to lead the practice under the doctor's brand, team, and strategy, but hopefully benefits from the resources of what is functionally a silent partner. These groups are not interested in homogenizing the practices they partner with. It's not interested in micromanaging what the doctor does. The doctor does not change how he hires or fires or what services he performs or when he's open or when he takes vacation. It's a very hands-off partnership, but the benefits to the doctors can be significant. So when I think of the word transition, I think of that as an exit. And what was really interesting last year is that out of our $612 million in transactions, 102 million of those were for doctors in their 30s. These guys weren't looking for an exit strategy. They were looking for a partnership with a partner that could help them grow their practice bigger, better, faster, and more profitably. And that's really been a dramatic change in the last couple of years where younger doctors are entering into these invisible DSO partnerships because they're beginning to realize that it's not about being micromanaged or homogenized. It's about accessing resources that can help them grow and create long-term wealth. As for interest rates, we really have not seen any significant impact in the number of bidders for our practices because of interest rates. We've not seen any reduction in values yet. I think ultimately we will. But at the moment, because of so much capital that has flowed into dental consolidation, you have many eager bidders. A typical client of ours will have 6 to 10 qualified bidders to choose from in their partnership.
Interesting. So what are some of the benefits then of a 30-something doc that wants to take some chips off the table? If, a big selling point or the pitch that we hear from a lot of DSOs is that, hey, we're going to come and buy a significant portion of your business. You can take some chips off the table. You can liquidate a portion of your equity. And with that, we're going to inject our systems and our hiring process and our ability to negotiate price with our vendors, et cetera. It sounds to me like some of those things aren't part of a sales pitch of a IDSO.
Yeah, the invisible DSOs really look at this as a partnership, and all of their practice partners are unique. Their goal is not to change what they're doing, certainly long before you enter into a partnership with one of these groups, you'll discuss what changes will occur. And in all of them, for example, they're going to become the manager of your banking, your payroll, your benefits administration, your compliance, your credentialing, and your payer and vendor negotiations. But they're not going to tell you what supplies to use. They're going to ask you, hey, what supplies or technology do you like? And we'll make sure that we help you get what you want at a lower cost. And same thing with team members. Certainly they have the ability to help you recruit. And they have teams that when you give them an order, let's call it, to say, hey, I need a new front desk or I need 2 new hygienists, they're going to help you find those people. They're going to help you screen for them. But ultimately, it's going to be up to you to interview and hire or not hire whoever that person is. And it'll be up to you to dictate how you compensate that person. They're not in the business of forcing things on their doctors. On the flip side, some of those benefits of reducing administrative burdens can help the doctors grow because they can focus on more productive things like patient care or practice expansion, rather than focusing on dealing with payroll next week. So these groups can provide a whole lot of benefits, but ultimately, the reason younger doctors are doing these transactions is because of the success in the growth of that equity that they retain. So just in September and October, there were $5 billion of recapitalizations for just 3 invisible DSOs. We'll talk about where the money for that came from because it's really an interesting story. But in those 3 invisible DSOs, we had sold those groups 137 practices just to those 3 groups. And our doctors were able to achieve returns on that retained equity, some as low as 150% in less than 36 months, and some over 500% in less than 36 months. So the reason younger doctors are attracted to these transactions is, frankly, there's a lot bigger upside in the potential equity of your partner or your practice with a partner than there is in building it by yourself, taking the personal risk and taking the time. These groups have been around for 35 years. This is not their first rodeo creating value.
What is a typical percentage that these IDSOs like to purchase?
That's a great question. And the answer is it's really up to the doctor. Last year, we did transactions that ranged from 51% cash, 49% equity, to 95% cash, 5% equity. Those 2 stories are really very telling about the cash versus equity concept because the 49% equity, 51% cash transaction was for a group of doctors all under the age of 40. And so they were very eager for their partner's equity upside. We closed that transaction in early March of last year, and their partner monetized in September, and their equity doubled in value in 6 months. Now, they're in it for the long term, so they didn't liquidate any of that, even though they could have. And on the other end of the spectrum, we had a 59-year-old doctor come to us and say, look, I'm only going to be here for 3 years. He had a great practice, 4 offices, 4 great associates. And he said, I want as much cash as possible because I'm not going to be around to see the value of the equity go up because I'm only going to be here 3 years. So in his transaction, which was about a $42.5 million transaction, he got 95% cash and 5% equity. The reality is the typical transaction is about 70-30, but it can be customized for what the doctor wants because he's going to have multiple bidder options to choose from. And really kind of important in that is when you have a multi-doc practice, each doctor can choose a different consideration mix. We see that a lot in oral surgery where you have 5 doctors, the young doctor's 35, the old doctor's 62, let's call it. And the 62-year-old doctor is more cash because he will not be around to see the equity multiply over the next 10 or 15 years. Whereas the younger doctor has a very long horizon to see his equity increase in value over time. And so in a transaction where you have multi-doctor practices, each doctor can choose a different consideration mix.
Got it. So what does the bullseye look like? What is the ideal practice that these IDSOs are shooting for? Multiple doctor practices, general practices, low overhead. What's ideal in their minds?
The key drivers are, number one, you have to have a basic level of operating earnings, or EBITDA. And EBITDA stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. But it's after considering compensation for the doctor to continue to do what they do on a go-forward basis. And the threshold number for EBITDA is about $500,000 after doctor compensation. And that's when you can start getting into high value transactions. Certainly a doctor with sub $300,000 in EBITDA can still do a deal with an invisible DSO, but they're not going to get the kind of values that we achieve for the larger practices. And to get to $500,000 in EBITDA, roughly a GP practice is going to have at least $1.8 million in collections, and specialists are sometimes lower. But the opening sort of ticket to the high value game is $500,000 in operating profit. The next thing that's really important today is growth rate. We saw a number of practices that were either flat or declining in 22 versus 21. And that becomes more challenging to achieve higher values. So the highest value practices today are those that are growing and have a growth plan. Another thing that they're looking at very carefully at the moment is team turnover. Practices that have very high team turnover are going to have fewer bidders than those who have a consistent long-term team. Doesn't mean you can't lose one or two, but if you've got a 15-person team and 12 of them are new in the last 2 years, that's a problem.
Got it. So let's circle back to something you alluded to earlier, and that's the recap. Typically for private equity, I know the recap is usually 5 years and then another 5 years. So 5 or 10 years. It sounds like the typical recap. I may be wrong. You can correct me. But where is this money coming from for these recapitalizations of these IDSOs?
It's really interesting in that it has changed. The general perception of doctors is that private equity is what backs all invisible DSOs, or DSOs for that matter. And yes, they do back a number of them. But to put it in perspective, we did at least $500 million in transactions with non-private equity backed invisible DSOs in the last 36 months. Other players in the game are family offices. Recently, we've had sovereign wealth funds get into the game. So the country of Abu Dhabi, which is actually the third largest sovereign wealth fund in the world after China and Norway, invested $1 billion in dental consolidation last quarter. Another interesting new entrant into the game is a group called BlackRock. BlackRock is the largest money manager in the world with $10 trillion under management. And so they entered the dental consolidation game last quarter with a token $2 billion. And then you had some interesting family office entrants into the game. On top of that, you have pension funds and you have what's called an SBIC, which is a small business investment corp. Let's call it sanctioned by the SBA, but operates like a private equity firm. So private equity firms, yes, you'll hear that they typically have a window of 5 years, whereas some of these other groups have different windows. Some of the family offices are interested in keeping their assets forever. There's one of the top 10 DSOs in the country is owned by a Swiss family office that will never sell it. They want it to be owned for generations. Coincidentally, they also own the largest DSO in Europe, and I expect they will merge those two together. And so since they don't have a traditional recapitalization event where they sell to generate profit for themselves and their doctor partners, they have a very prescriptive system that enables the doctors to monetize their equity with private equity-like returns at set periods of time. So the recapitalization events, the 4 of the $5 billion that happened last quarter were all created by groups that recapitalized, one within 35 months and one within 42 months. So 5 years is not a set deal. One of the great builders of invisible DSOs that has built 7 of them in the last 10 years has had exits in as brief as 2 years on one, 3 years on another, 4 years on another. So the 5-year exit is certainly a generalization, but each one is different in how they're going to exit. And COVID slowed a lot of exits down.
Gotcha. Okay. So if you're a young doc, you're in your 30s and you are interested in what you and I are talking about right now, taking some chips off the table or utilizing the um, this strategy to have an IDSO partner come into your life. Are you looking, or what is more beneficial? Some group that is early in the recap cycle or later in the recap cycle, as far as what people would call that second bite of the apple?
A lot of that is dependent upon who the investor is. We always tell doctors that the management of the invisible DSO is certainly important, but ultimately what you have to understand is who the investor is and what their track record is in dental consolidation and in multi-site healthcare consolidation. So the answer to that question is you don't know. There are some groups that are brand new right now that are out pitching themselves as, hey, if you join us, you're getting in early. You've got the biggest equity upside. And frankly, there are a lot of those groups that are going to fail because they have no strategy. They may have plenty of money, but without a strategy to actually build value, they'll fail. And more of that is coming as this has become a very popular place for investors. On the flip side, when we look at groups, we're always looking at the risk reward, and we're also looking at the doctor's time horizons and goals. Just because you're big doesn't mean you're going to get a lower return. Or if you're going with a big invisible DSO, it's about how that invisible DSO is managed. I'll give you a great example of two invisible DSOs, both with about 300 offices as of January 21. So here it is 2 years later, and one of those DSOs went from 300 offices to 560 offices in that 2-year period of time.
Wow.
So they grew, and when you're growing, you create value. Another one with 300 offices went from about 300 to 340 offices in that same 2-year period. So one of them almost doubled their number of practices, and one of them increased by 12%. So the group that was growing created a whole lot of equity value for the doctors, whereas the group that was not growing didn't create any equity value for their doctors. So size is not necessarily what dictates the performance of your equity return. A lot of it has to do with who the investor is and what their strategy is.
Got it. Okay. So when people are interviewing potential suitors for their practice, what are some of the things that they can do to control or to potentially increase that multiple that they're going to be offered? So in other words, what factors increase multiples prior to sale?
There's a lot of different factors that drive multiples. A lot of what we do is because we know the landscape. Obviously, we're doing business with dozens of invisible DSOs. And really the number one driver for value is understanding who wants what, when, where, and why. These groups will pay higher values for practices in certain geographies or of certain types at certain moments in time. So I'll give you an example of that. Unfortunately, this is not something the doctor can control. It's just how it works. When we have 6 to 10 bidders for one of our clients, they're getting to see various options because this is like a marriage. Ultimately, the group you choose, you're going to be living with for the next at least 5 years and perhaps longer, and hopefully longer. They want you to stay until you die. So a lot of creating value has to do with knowing who wants what, when, where, and why. I'll give you a great example. We have a group of practices in New York at the moment that are near each other. And when we find multiple practices near each other, we can usually get a higher value for all of them. And the group that we thought would be the high bidder for that group at about $51 million, just got outbid by a group by $10 million at $61 million. Because that group called me up and we sold them a dozen practices west of the Rockies last year. They got a new CEO who called me up and said, we want to come east. Where should we go? I said, I have a great group of practices for you in New York State, and here's why you want them. And so that was not about anything that the doctors did or didn't do. It was just about knowing how to be in the right place at the right time. And that happens a lot. As far as what doctors have control over to create value, it's all about operating profit. Operating profit and growth rate are what dictates value. Certainly low team turnover is important, Location is important, and I don't mean what street corner you're on, but what city you're in. So, for instance, a practice in Albany, New York is a lot more valuable than a practice in Buffalo, New York. Why? Because Albany is the capital of the state. They're never going to run out of money. Buffalo might, but the politicians will make sure that Albany never runs out of money. So your regional location is important. Obviously, these groups are very eager for the Sun Belt. You know, the hottest regions at the moment are, let's call it, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, Colorado, Arizona. Doesn't mean you can't get great values in other states. We did a great deal for a practice in the absolute middle of nowhere, New Mexico, a couple of weeks ago, and got him an extraordinary value. It was about a $19 million deal for a single doctor practice.
Whoa.
Extraordinarily lucrative practice. It was an oral surgeon. So the things that doctors can do to create value really are to clean up your numbers. Doesn't mean you have to stop running the personal expenses through your practice, because everybody does it. The buyers are used to seeing that. It's not an issue. But the ability to produce numbers on a timely fashion. You know, we talked to doctors today that still have not got their year-end numbers done. And that's inexcusable. You should be looking at your numbers on a weekly, bi-weekly, or at least monthly basis, because that's how you manage your practice. So I think one of the number one drivers to get higher values is to be ready, to have your numbers clean. Growth is important. We see some doctors that when they start this process, take their foot off the gas and they stop growing during the middle of this process, and that hurts them. So never take your foot off the gas as you're going into or contemplating one of these processes, because growth is valuable.